In this video, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about constitutionalism and the Constitution as a means of justifying state authority. In my opinion, the single best written work on exposing constitutionalism as a type of fraud was done by Lysander Spooner, a constitutional attorney around the time of the Civil War. He wrote an essay called No Treason, the Constitution of No Authority, to explain the legal reasons why the Constitution is inapplicable to the general population and why it does not serve as a justification for state authority. So the mythology goes that the government has a law that it has to abide by in service to the people who are called citizens. It has to abide by a number of rules that keep it supposedly in check. It has to abide by these rules to preserve human rights in the course of its work as protector. And that by means of the Constitution, in some abstract sense, the people control the state, or that the state is somehow accountable to the people. The primary problem with this is the fact that the people doesn't actually exist. The United States of America is a concept. Any other country is merely a concept on paper. It's like a corporation, not a person, not any kind of agency. It is an abstract idea that has no actual objective manifestation. Individual persons do have a real manifestation and actually exhibit the qualities of agency. Human beings can experience a satisfaction of preferences or an infraction against their person or property. Real humans can experience crime. Real humans can experience joy. Only real humans can sign contracts. In the opening text of the Constitution of No Authority, Lysander Spooner makes the point that a contract is only a valid binding agreement when made between person and person. He notes that under general principles of law and reason, the Constitution could only have been binding on the people who signed it, and that at most it applies only to people then living, and that it is binding on none of their posterity. He goes on to explain how this translates to mean that the Constitution cannot properly authorize people to act on its behalf, that any authority the Constitution would have given to the government actually does not reside with those who call themselves government. He notes that if the same thing were to happen between a robber and his victim that has happened between governments of the world and their respective citizens, we would basically be talking about the robber saying he's going to consistently rob his victim and provide his version of protection whether or not his victim wants to comply or has ever. This type of arrangement epitomizes a failed burden of justification for authority. It's to say that government, or specifically the persons who comprise it, are acting on authority that has essentially been made up and has only been propagated to the modern day because people are willing to believe claims to authority on bad reasoning. Further problems with constitutionalism are exposed by the fact that taxation, authorized by the Constitution, cannot confer consent to the government by the person who is paying taxes, because taxes are collected under duress. It cannot be a valid contract because at least one party is being threatened by the other. Even under current law as it stands, a contract made under duress is invalid. Yet, most of the contract the average private citizen makes with government are under duress. You will be arrested and put in a cage if you don't sign or agree to the government's demands. This is getting into what is called social contract theory. In the modern sense, social contract applies to the Constitution. Now, there are numerous problems with social contract as a means of justifying the state's authority. First and foremost is this idea that because of the social contract, where you're born determines who you are effectively owned by, and whose opinions you must comply with under threat of weighty punishments, unless you're willing to move to another human farm. Yet, If you lived in my neighborhood and I, let's say, spray painted your house pink, and let's say you were really mad about this, and you told me that what I had done was a criminal infraction against your property, which it is. But I come back saying, you've agreed to the social contract of being my next door neighbor. And according to this social contract that you never actually signed, I have the right to paint your house whatever color I prefer. And if you disagree, you can move. If I were to do this, you'd call me a kook and try me as a criminal, because that's the only rational way to see the situation. Yet we make this grand exception for the state and pretend like its similar justifications for its authority actually hold up. One of the primary reasons that people still believe the Constitution and social contract in general justifies state authority is because people have been conditioned to love the state, to believe that it has the authority it claims it does. Sadly, most people in modern society are ethically illiterate, and the only reason we have advanced the way we have is because natural selection has weeded out the societies that are more violent, leaving only the peaceful ones to continue propagating the human race. I'm saying we can actually act upon our knowledge, we can exercise ethics, and we can proactively be better human beings. But because we live in a paradigm of might makes right, because the current model of society justifies parents hitting their kids and calling it spanking, because we live in a society where being put in a cage is justice, we're willing to accept claims to authority from anyone who wields bigger weapons. Yes, the government wields bigger weapons, but that's because its specialization is the use of force. Its economic niche is violence. It sells violence to its contractors, which could be any number of state-created legal entities like corporations or banks or other governments. Its product is violence. Its product is threats. And modern states have become incredibly good at using these threats and at using violence primarily because a large component of their resources are dedicated to public relations. They have a vested interest, an enormous vested interest, in continuing to propagate the lie that they have the authority they claim they do. Constitutionalism is a demonstrably potent way of getting at least a large portion of the human livestock that they control to continue believing in their authority. Because they posit it as a type of contract between the state and the people, they again appeal to the collective as a type of entity with its own agency, which it's not, of course. But under the guise of the collective God, of the will of the people, they can pretend the Constitution serves as a valid contract between agency and agency. It doesn't. It fails on these counts completely. But let's do a thought exercise for a moment. What if the Constitution actually constrained government to the level of its justified authority? It could not legally grant the power to tax, because taxation is the confiscation of resources under threat of weighty punishments, being fined more money, or being put in a cage, or being beaten because you've avoided arrest for not paying your unilaterally determined dues. It could not pretend to own its jurisdiction and everyone and everything in it as it effectively does, and at the same time call itself a protector of property. These are a contradiction in terms. Governments are property confiscating, property destroying, property protectors, which makes no sense. If the Constitution were strictly limited to precisely what authority could be justified, government would be no much more than an insurance company competing with a number of other insurance companies, collecting voluntarily paid premiums from voluntarily subscribed customers, and having no jurisdiction around which to establish an enforceable border. One of the most useful aspects of constitutionalism is the fact that because it is the constraint on government, anything it justifies can be seen as perfectly acceptable for governments to do. So if the chief apologist wing of the government, the Supreme Court, is able to construe a new meaning from the Constitution, thereby expanding state powers, people are willing to accept this new authority because someone in the government was able to say the Constitution authorizes it. This, of course, makes no sense. Through this method, constitutions have served as a means to expand state power within a scope that is amenable to the general population who is gullible enough to believe the Constitution actually constrains government. The last point I want to make about constitutionalism is the failure of elections to actually justify the Constitution. It has been asserted that the Constitution is supported by people who vote in favor of sustaining it by voting for particular candidates. However, no one is actually offered the choice to cancel their subscription with the federal government. No one can actually say, I don't want to be part of this Constitution anymore, I don't want to be part of the collective it creates, but I want to keep my property where it is. Well, because the government, de facto, owns everything in its jurisdiction, it will simply punish you for disobeying and confiscate your resources if you actually try to go through with this. Voting, at best, is a means of defending yourself against the tyranny of other people who might think differently about how government should oppress people. Politics gets so vitriolic precisely because people are fighting over an instrument of violence to control everyone else according to their own preferences. There's a good reason people say don't discuss politics over the dinner table or with family, and it's precisely because you're going to offend somebody by saying, I think you should be thrown in jail for smoking a plant, or I think half of your income should be confiscated to pay for my kid's schooling. These are things that would not be said in polite conversation, and only through politics do they become realistic threats against people we love. I am going to talk about the problems with democracy and elections in other videos, but for now I want to finish by saying that elections do not serve as a justification for the perpetuity of the Constitution. It does not support the Constitution or the jurisdiction it establishes. Voting, as an anonymous process, does not contractually obligate anyone to anyone else. It is in no way the sustenance of a contractual agreement or obligation. And what voting actually is for is to continue the hype that people support the government generally. Even though voting virtually accomplishes nothing in the way of obligating government to serve the people, if the state did not grant you the ability to vote, it would be a lot harder for you to believe that they have the authority they claim they do. Elections are primarily tools of propaganda. They're meant to make you think that you have some control over the state when you actually don't. The only way you could actually have control over the state is if you could personally secede from it. To say, I'm going to seek alternative means of resolving disputes than by appealing to the United States federal government. But of course, we don't have that option so long as we live in the human farm called the United States of America, where if anyone tries to secede, a few 100,000 people in patchwork uniforms will be murdered by the US federal government. As demonstrated by America's greatest tyrant, Abraham Lincoln, a man you have no doubt been conditioned to worship from childhood, precisely because he is, in reality, such an evil bastard, but whose work has proved so important for the continued growth and increasing power of the American empire. When someone tells you the Constitution justifies state authority, or that some ethereal social contract does the same, be skeptical.